Hera.
It was a time of instability on Olympus, for Hades, our dear brother, had finally found a match. Persephone, goddess of spring, now queen of the underworld. She was fitting into her new role, growing and changing, morphing into a formidable queen indeed. But her mother, my sister, Demeter, goddess of agriculture and the harvest, was less than pleased. She scoured the earth as a mother who had thought her child lost, and in her grief, in her anger, had cursed the nymphs that were supposed to protect her precious daughter. Demeter transformed them, like she did the very soils of earth. One she stripped of body, the other she deprived of life. The nymphs were lucky in a way. They may no longer connect with the seas, the waters. They may not have the feminine curves and figures they once did. But they now had wings, feathers, claws, where soft skin should be. Still blessed with beauty in their faces, their voices enhanced and enchanting. And the wings, a curse to be changed, but a gift to fly in the skies with the clouds and the stars. The feathers were dark, but with an iridescent sheen that shone every colour of the rainbow, glorious under sunlight. Demeter still had use for them, but also she still cared about them. Despite her rage, they thought that perhaps she would forgive them in time. And so, they obeyed her command. From hope and guilt, they searched the lands, watched as the plants died, and searched the barren wastes as well. They searched for her, for any sign or soul that knew of Persephone. When the Sirens found nothing, Demeter, our stubborn sister, brought the first winter to the world. And she took too much. She took too much from the mortals and from we gods. For when the mortals began to starve, when they lost soul after soul without explanation, with every unanswered prayer for food, warmth, mercy, they lost their faith. They stopped belief, they stopped prayer, and stopped sacrifice. And my husband, king of Olympus, the gods and the mortals, Zeus himself, summoned Demeter, for her actions now became the problem of all. We were all suffering. Olympus and the gods, for our palace, our kingdom, was cracking and crumbling around us. Without sacrifice, we are not whole. And we did not know what would happen if we had let this continue. With the perishing mortals, they could all die. And what would become of us? Would we lose our power? Could we lose our lives? Demeter had gone too far, and she ignored our summons. She continued to hold the world hostage. She showed the world that perhaps our sister is too powerful, especially since she never showed for the summons. A direct insult. Zeus had no choice but to bend to her will. We all had no choice. That is beyond insult now. That is a direct threat to our power and our rule. even though Hades came to Zeus, the girl's father, for permission. Even though Persephone ate the seeds, which by the laws of the underworld ties her to the land, Demeter still got her way. This is where the problem lies. Our sweet sister has shown too much strength. She had gotten what she'd wanted. Damn the laws, damn the mortals, and damning us. She would have killed us all. And now the whole court, the universe, knows she has the power to do so. This is where our tale begins. For Demeter, we cannot directly threaten her now. It would be too obvious, too callous, and could cause an uprising. To punish a mother for reacting to the loss of her child? Gods and goddesses would flock to her side if a war broke out. But with actions come consequences. When punishment must be dished out, a show of strength made to secure our position. My husband, Zeus, has shown this with the rulers before, our aunts and uncles. When a god defies the rules, we must be there to give retribution. Such is the responsibility of a ruler. We cannot allow others to get ideas. Zeus handled Prometheus, for he can punish and must show unchallenging strength. But Demeter will have to be handled differently. It must be handled with delicacy and cunning. I will deal with Demeter. It must not be blatant. A full show of knocking Demeter back into place may go badly. And yet, there is need for consequence, and it must be public. For this is more about the court than Demeter herself. We must show them who holds the power, who is still in charge. A warning, a deterrent, not to push too far again. And laying in the sun at the top of the mountain, as I looked out, it came to me. I called to my husband to gather the court. We must have a celebration. Demeter had stayed away from the festivals and feasts on Olympus for some time now, contented to be in her little grove, with her nymphs, now siren creatures, flocking desperately for her approval. I could see it in them, how they longed for forgiveness, the guilt of losing Persephone evident in each of them. Too eager, too desperate for the approval they had lost. And I had found my key. We invited all to celebrate the first spring, and the new peace after the short strife we had all endured. A symbol of unity and togetherness in our family once more. Zeus agreed and sent out the summons, and all flocked to the mountain. The Muses sang songs to welcome in the masses as they all passed through the gates to Olympus. Zeus and I stood above the crowds, king and queen, greeting them all. Even Demeter with her 3 sirens in a row behind her. Theoxiope, Molpi, and Aglaphonos. They were an even worse sight up close. Bodies of feathers, enormous wings, and grotesque clawed feet. But their faces, like porcelain masks on monstrous creatures. They crowded around Demeter, even as she went from god to goddess, greeting family and friends. She had to dismiss them herself when they wouldn't leave her side. She went to the ambrosia table, and I went to whisper in their ears. Welcome, Sirens. I would like to personally thank you in taking care of my sister during her tough times. If only you could prove to her somehow of your loyalty. Then she might be more eager to break the curse on your bodies. At least she left your faces and songs. I have heard they are a thing of beauty to behold. And know that even if my sister will not say it, we are thankful to you. And remember, favor can be won. I hope she smiles on you with pride once more. Soon. Enjoy the feast, my friends. I wandered to the table of wines, waving at Poseidon and smiling at Hestia as she handed me a cup. The evening proceeded as usual. Dancing and music, shouts and laughter echoed from across the mountain into the valley below. Zeus smiled from across the room. I winked in his direction. He turned to the players, the satyrs and hamadryads all playing musical instruments, pipes and lutes with such skill. The Muses, mothers to the Sirens, were singing their graceful songs, recounting old victories and sad losses from wars recently past, until new voices were heard above the crowd. Suddenly, two choirs of voices were clashing above the music. Gods, goddesses, and the crowd around looked to each other with confusion. Satyrs and nymphs were drawn to both. Under a trance, they began to run into each other to find the sources of both songs at once. Chaos was beginning to erupt in earnest, but with a wave of the king's hand, everything stopped. The songs and the erratic crowds.
Stop. The Muses sing their songs tonight, but whose voices sing out above?
We do, your majesty. In fact, we, Theloxi, Melopi, and Galophonos, challenge the Muses themselves to sing a more beautiful song than we.
The crowd gasped. Contests happen often on Olympus and at feasts, too. But seldom do people challenge the Muses themselves, and to challenge them in their own craft. Foolish indeed. But they stepped forward as Zeus called for the crowds to part. The Muses emerged from the crowd in a perfect pattern. They exuded grace and power. Dressed all in white, they aligned themselves in a neat row. Clio, the muse of history. Euterpe, the muse of lyric poetry. Thalia, the muse of comedy. Melpomene, the muse of tragedy. Terpsichore, the muse of choral song and dancing. Erato, the muse of erotic poetry and mime. Polyhymnia, the muse of religious hymns. Urania, the muse of astronomy and all astronomical writings. And finally, Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. They stood before the nymphs they once called daughters. They bowed in unison to the bird creatures, accepting the challenge. For the river god Archelaus, a son of Oceanus and Tethys, was father to the nymphs now called Sirens, sired with a muse. Whether the mother be Melpomene, Terpsichore, or any of the others, the courts did gossip, but it did not matter in the end. For they stood in 2 rows before Zeus and the gathering crowds at the feast. The Sirens issued the challenge, and so they sang their song first. Their voices began and echoed around the air. Beautiful songs, high-pitched and harmonizing together. They sang of wishes and dreams, the promises of the hearts around them in the crowd. Each of us heard a different temptation in their song, and yet the song was the same. Any mortal would not have stood the song they sang that night. But we as gods heard in their glorious breath the hollow hopes, the false promises. Their song was but a pretty lie that turned to ashes on the wind. In their desperation, they sang of the darker wishes we held, the twisted wants that would push us to love their song. But it was ugly, too much, as they finished their final note, an empty whisper among the crowds. The Sirens saw they did not win us, could not woo us with their facade of beauty. They looked to Demeter with disheartened eyes, with a plea in the irises. But Demeter emptied her cup and turned to get another. I had to contain my own grin at the sight. And so, the Muses stepped forward as the Sirens shrank back. At first, just Cleo sang of celebrations and heroes of our past, their great deeds that brought them fame and renown. Euterpe accompanied her on double flute. Somehow the flute's notes echoed with voices. As she played, the high music rung with the laughter of sheer delight. Thalia joined in harmony, singing of our past rich festivities, all the old jokes shared over wines and dance, our happy times together as a family, the early days of blooming youth, and when the crowd could smile no more. Melpomene joined the harmony. She sang of our darker times, hard struggles and strife, but the power we had to keep going through it all, the spirit of our souls as we endured it all together, and we all felt tears streak our eyes as one. Terpsichore accompanying the sweet tragedy with the strum of her lyre, Erato stepped forward and added to the song. She sang of love, the passion and desire between two souls, the impossible feeling of it all. Aurania took that love and added even more layers to the piece. She sang the tales of our beginning, the stars, the planets, the primordial gods we came from. She waved her rod with the celestial globe atop it, and the stars shone brighter in response. Polyhymnia stepped forward and joined the choir. She sang of praise and praised us all, the old gods and the new, with enchanting hymns that mentioned each god in attendance. Calliope, the last in the line, added a final harmony of epic poetry. It spoke to each soul at that feast, for she was the most eloquent of all. Their song was above any we had heard them sing before. As they finished their final effervescent note, the crowd burst into loud applause. Cheering and thunderous voices screamed out in love for the Muses and their song. With wide, smug expressions, the Muses stepped forward and took in the praise. The crowds were deafening as I looked to my husband and nodded. As Zeus raised his hand, the whole crowd silenced.
My Muses have won, as they always do. What do you wish as a prize for my daughters? What do you ask of the Sirens for the disrespect, the insult of your very purpose?
They asked for what I told them. A fitting reward for a winner is a crown. The 3 Sirens were at a loss, for they did not have any gold or jewels, let alone crowns for all 9 Muses. But their feathers, the new iridescent shine to them. They would make beautiful crowns indeed. The Sirens could not object to it. So they stood helplessly as the Muses circled the three of them. Melopoly and Aglafonos tried to cower behind Thelloxope, but she looked beyond the Muses. She looked for Demeter's eyes, that plea returning. Demeter met her gaze, and for a moment made to move. But then I stepped forward, and she met my firm gaze. Then it seemed to click in her mind, as I, very minusculely, shook my head, warning her. There was silence as the Muses pulled at the Sirens' feathers. Slow at first, then they became more frantic, plucking more and more, 3 Muses to each Siren. Cries of pain and odd bird squawks filled the air, but I held my gaze on Demeter. This continued for some time, as we stood and listened. The crowd gathered to witness, Ares laughing with drunken Dionysus. Others looked on in horror, when the Muses finally scattered away from the Sirens, the feathers clutched in their hands. The 3 women were on the ground. Some feathers remained on their bodies, but their wings were plucked clean. Fresh blood leaked onto their skin as they lay moaning. I finally broke my gaze on Demeter to see that the whole court had been staring at her too. Everyone had been watching, waiting with bated breath to see how she would respond. And she lowered her gaze to the floor once more. She walked away from her Sirens and back to the table, filled with cups of ambrosia. Persephone went to her side, and the crowds went back to celebrating. The feasting and dancing did not stop until dawn, and all was set right once more. The court saw Demeter bow down to us, the balance of the universe finally restored. We kept the Sirens on Olympus to heal after the festivities, for a short time. They were healed quickly, but they would never fly again. Hermes, with the help of Apollo and his chariot, dropped the Sirens back at Demeter's grove, but they were a painful reminder to her. Soon she grew tired of the hollow songs they sang. The illusion of their beauty shattered when it all became too much. She left them. She took them to a flowery island, once called Anthimosa, but would be known as the Island of the Sirens to the heroes that stumble across its path. But that is a tale for another time.